Dare to enter the haunted realm. Journey into a world where the supernatural blurs the lines of reality, where the past refuses to stay buried, and where the darkest secrets of the human heart are brought to light. Journey into a world where the supernatural blurs the lines of reality, where the past refuses to stay buried, and where the darkest secrets of the human heart are brought to light. Prepare to be captivated by Dickens' timeless tales of terror. Watch 3 ghost stories now. Stories 1. The Haunted House's Morning. Chapter 1. The Mortals in the House. No period within the 24 hours of day and night is so solemn to me as the early morning. In summertime, I often rise very early and repair to my room to do a day's work before breakfast. I am always, on these occasions, deeply impressed by the stillness and solitude. There's something unsettling about being surrounded by familiar faces asleep. Knowing those dearest to us, and to whom we are dearest, are profoundly unconscious of us, in an impassive state, anticipative of that mysterious condition to which we are all tending. The stopped life, the broken threads of yesterday, the deserted seat, the closed book, the unfinished but abandoned occupation, all images of death. The tranquility of the hour is the tranquility of death. The color and the chill have the same association. Even the way familiar household objects emerge from the shadows of night into the morning, seeming newer as they used to be long ago, resembles the subsidence of a worn face of maturity in death into the old youthful look. I once saw my father's apparition at this hour. He was alive and well, and nothing came of it, but I saw him in the daylight, sitting with his back to me on a seat beside my bed. His head rested on his hand, and I couldn't tell if he was slumbering or grieving. Amazed, I sat up, moved, leaned out of bed, and watched him. As he didn't move, I spoke to him. When he still didn't move, I became alarmed and laid my hand upon his shoulder, as I thought, and there was nothing there. For these reasons, and others less easily stated, I find the early morning my most ghostly time. Any house would feel haunted to me then, and a haunted house could scarcely address me to greater advantage. I walked into the village, thinking about this house's desertion. The landlord of the small inn was sanding his doorstep. I ordered breakfast and broached the subject of the house. "Is it haunted?" I asked. He looked at me, shook his head, and answered, "I say nothing." "Then it is haunted." "Well," he cried, with a frankness that seemed desperate, "I wouldn't sleep in it." "Why not?" "If I wanted all the bells ringing with nobody to ring them, and all the doors banging with nobody to bang them, and all sorts of feet treading about with no feet there." "Why then," said the landlord, "I'd sleep in that house. Is anything seen there?" He looked at me again, then, with his former desperation, called down his stable yard for Eerie. A high-shouldered young fellow appeared. Round red face, sandy hair, a broad, humorous mouth, a turned-up nose, and a great-sleeved waistcoat of purple bars with mother-of pearl buttons. It seemed to be growing upon him, and if not pruned, would cover his head and overrun his boots. "This gentleman wants to know," said the landlord, "if anything's seen at the Poplars." "Hooded woman with a owl," said Eerie, very fresh. "Do you mean a cry?" "I mean a bird, sir." "A hooded woman with an owl. Dear me, did you ever see her?" "I seen the owl, never the woman. Not so plain as the owl, but they always keeps together." "Has anybody ever seen the woman as plainly as the owl?" "Lord bless you, sir, lots who." "Lord bless you, sir, lots." The general dealer opposite, for instance, who was opening his shop, Perkins. "Bless you, Perkins wouldn't go anigh the place." "No," observed the young man, with considerable feeling. "He ain't overwise, ain't Perkins, but he ain't such a fool as." Here the landlord murmured his confidence in Perkins, knowing better. "Who is, or was, the hooded woman with the owl, do you know?" "Well," said Icky, holding up his cap with one hand while he scratched his head with the other. "They say in general that she was murdered, and the owl he ooted the while." "Who is, or was, the hooded woman with the owl, do you know?" "Well," said Icky, holding up his cap with one hand while he scratched his head with the other. "They say in general that she was murdered, and the owl he ooted the while." This concise summary was all I could learn, except that a young man, as hearty and likely a young man as ever I see, had been took with fits after seeing the hooded woman. Also, that a personage, described as an old chap, a one-eyed tramp answering to the name of Joby, unless you challenged him as Greenwood, and then he said, "Why not? And even if so, mind your own business," had encountered the hooded woman 5 or 6 times. I wasn't materially assisted by these witnesses, as the first was in California, and the last was, as Icky said and the landlord confirmed, anywheres. Now, although I regard with hushed fear the mysteries between this state of existence and the great trial and change that fall on all living things, and although I don't pretend to know anything of them, I can no more reconcile mere banging of doors, ringing of bells, creaking of boards, and such insignificances with the majestic beauty and analogy of all the divine rules I understand, than I could yoke the spiritual intercourse of my fellow traveler to the chariot of the rising sun. Moreover, I'd lived in 2 haunted houses abroad. In one, an old Italian palace with a reputation for being badly haunted, and recently twice abandoned on that account. I lived 8 months, tranquilly and pleasantly, this despite the house having a score of mysterious bedrooms never used and possessing, in one large room where I sat reading times out of number, at all hours, and next to which I slept, a haunted chamber of the first I gently hinted these considerations to the landlord. As to this particular house having a bad name, I reasoned with him. How many things had bad names undeservedly, and how easy it was to give bad names. Did he not think that if he and I persistently whispered in the village that any weird-looking, old, drunken tinker had sold himself to the devil, he would, in time, be suspected of that commercial venture? This wise talk was perfectly ineffective. I am bound to confess it was as dead a failure as ever I made in my life. To cut this short, I was piqued about the haunted house and half resolved to take it. So, after breakfast, I got the keys from Perkins' brother, or whip and harness maker, postmaster, and under submission to a rigorous wife of doubly succeeding little Emmanuel persuasion, I went to the house, attended by my landlord and Icky. Inside, as expected, it was transcendently dismal. The shadows from the heavy trees were doleful. The house was ill-placed, ill-built, ill-planned, and ill-fitted. It was damp, not free from dry rot, had a flavor of rats, and was the gloomy victim of that decay settling on all man's work when not turned to his account. The kitchens and offices were too large and remote from each other. Above and below stairs, waste tracts of passage intervened between rooms. A mouldy old well with green growth, like a murderous trap, hid near the back stairs, under the double row of bells. One bell was labeled, on a black ground, in faded white letters. Master B. This, they told me, was the bell that rang the most. Who was Master B? I asked. Is it known what he did while the owl hooted? Rang the bell, said Icky. I was struck by the prompt dexterity with which this young man pitched his fur cap at the bell and rang it himself. It was a loud, unpleasant bell. The other bells were inscribed with the names of their rooms, picture room, double room, clock room, and the like. Following Master B's bell, I found that young gentleman to have had indifferent, third-class accommodation in a triangular cabin under the It had a corner fireplace, at which Master B must have been exceedingly small if he ever warmed himself, and a corner chimney-piece, like a pyramidal staircase to the ceiling for Tom Thumb. The papering on one side had dropped down bodily, with plaster fragments, and almost blocked the door. Apparently, Master B, in his spiritual condition, always pulled the paper down. Neither the landlord nor Icky could suggest why, except that the house had a large, rambling loft. I made no other discoveries. It was moderately, but sparsely, furnished. Some furniture, say a third, was as old as the house. The rest was from various periods within the last half-century. I was referred to a corn chandler in the county town to treat for the house. I went that day and took it for 6 months. It was mid-October when I moved in with my maiden sister. I ventured to call her 8-30. She is so handsome, sensible, and engaging. We took with us a deaf stableman, my bloodhound Turk, 2 women servants, and a young person called an odd girl. I have reason to record of the last enumerated attendant, who was one of the St. Lawrence's Union female orphans, that she was a fatal mistake and a disastrous engagement. The year was dying early. Leaves were falling fast. It was a raw, cold day when we took possession, and the house's gloom was depressing. The cook, an amiable woman but of weak intellect, burst into tears on beholding the kitchen, requesting that her silver watch be delivered to her sister, to Tuppentuck's Gardens, Liggs's Walk, Clapham Rise, in the event of anything happening to her from the damp. Streaker, the housemaid, feigned cheerfulness, but was the greater martyr. The odd girl, never having been in the country alone, was pleased and made arrangements for sowing an acorn outside the scullery window and rearing an oak. Before dark, we went through all the natural, as opposed to supernatural, miseries of our state. Dispiriting reports ascended like smoke from the basement and descended from the upper rooms. There was no rolling pin, there was no salamander, which failed to surprise me. For I don't know what it is. There was nothing in the house. What there was broken. The last people must have lived like pigs. What could the landlord's meaning be? Through these distresses, the odd girl was cheerful and exemplary. But within 4 hours after dark, we'd gotten into a supernatural groove, and the odd girl had seen eyes and was in hysterics. My sister and I had agreed to keep the haunting to ourselves, and my impression was, and still is, that I hadn't left Icky when he helped unload the cart, alone with the women for a minute. Nevertheless, as I say, the odd girl had seen eyes. No other explanation could ever be drawn from her before 9. By 10 o'clock, she'd had enough vinegar applied to her to pickle a handsome salmon. I leave a discerning public to judge my feelings when, under these circumstances, at about 10:30, Master B's bell began to ring furiously, and Turk howled until the house resounded. I hope I may never again be in such an unchristian state of mind as that in which I lived for some weeks, respecting the memory of Master B, whether his bell was rung by rats, mice, bats, wind, accidental vibration, or sometimes by one cause, sometimes another, and sometimes by collusion, I don't know. But certain it is that it did ring 2 nights out of 3, until I conceived the happy idea of twisting Master B's neck, breaking his bell short off, and silencing that young gentleman, as to my experience and belief, forever. But by that time, the odd girl had developed such improving powers of catalepsy that she'd become a shining example of that inconvenient disorder. She would stiffen like a Guy Fawkes endowed with unreason, on the most irrelevant occasions. I would address the servants lucidly, pointing out that I'd painted Master B's room, balked the paper, taken Master B's bell away, and balked the ringing. If they could suppose that that confounded boy had lived and died to clothe himself with no but better behavior than would have brought him and a birch broom into close acquaintance in this imperfect state of existence, could they also suppose a mere human being, such as I was, capable, by those contemptible means, of counteracting the powers of the disembodied spirits of the dead, or of any spirits? I would become emphatic and cogent, not to say rather complacent, in such an address, when it would all go for nothing because the odd girl would suddenly stiffen and glare among us like a parochial petrifaction. Streaker, the housemaid, too, had a most discomforting attribute. Whether she was of an unusually lymphatic temperament, or what else was the matter, this young woman became a mere distillery for the largest, most transparent tears I ever met with. Combined with this was a peculiar tenacity, so they didn't fall but hung upon her face and nose. In this condition, mildly and deplorably shaking her head, her silence would throw me more heavily than the admirable Crichton could have done in a verbal disputation for a purse of money. Cook, likewise, always covered me with confusion by neatly winding up the session with the protest that the owls were wearing her out, and meekly repeating her last wishes regarding her silver watch. As to our nightly life, the contagion of suspicion and fear was among us, and there's no such contagion under the sky. Hooded woman. According to accounts, we were in a perfect convent of hooded women. Noises. With that contagion downstairs, I myself have sat in the dismal parlor, listening, until I heard so many strange noises that they would have chilled my blood had I not warmed it by dashing out to make discoveries. Try this in bed, in the dead of night. Try this at your fireside, in the life of the night. You can fill any house with noises until you have a noise for every nerve. I repeat, the contagion was among us. The women, their noses excoriated from smelling salts, were always primed for a swoon, ready to go off with head triggers. The two elder detached the odd girl on doubly hazardous expeditions, and she always established their reputation by returning cataleptic. If Cook or Streaker went overhead after dark, we'd presently hear a bump on the ceiling. This took place so constantly, it was as if a fighting man went about the house, administering a touch of his art called, I believe, the auctioneer to every domestic he met with. It was in vain to do anything. In vain to be frightened by a real owl, and then to show the owl. In vain to discover, by striking a discord on the piano, that Turk howled at particular notes. In vain to be a Rhadamanthus, with the bells and silence any unfortunate one ringing without leave. In vain to fire up chimneys, let torches down the well, charge into suspected rooms. We changed servants, and it was no better. The new set ran away. A third set came, and it was no better. At last, our housekeeping became so disorganized that I dejectedly said to my sister, "Patty, I begin to despair of getting people to go on with us here, and I think we must give this up." My sister, a woman of immense spirit, replied, "No, John, don't give it up. Don't be beaten, John. There is another way." "And what is that?" I said. "John," she returned, "if we are not to be driven out of this house for no apparent reason, we must help ourselves and take it wholly into our own hands." "But the servants," I said. "Have no servants," said my sister, boldly. Like most in my station, I'd never thought of going on without those faithful obstructions. The notion was so new that I looked doubtful. "We know they come here to be frightened and infect one another," said my sister. "And we know they are frightened and do infect one another. With the exception of Bottles," I observed, meditatively, "the deaf stableman I kept him, and still keep him, as a phenomenon of moroseness not to be matched in England. To be sure, John, assented my sister, except Bottles. And what does that go to prove? Bottles talks to nobody, and hears nobody unless roared at. What alarm has Bottles ever given, or taken? None. This was perfectly true. Bottles retired every night at 10 to his bed over the coach house, with only a pitchfork and a pail of water. That the pail would have been over me, and the pitchfork through me, if I'd put myself unannounced in Bottles' way after that minute I'd deposited in my mind as fact. Bottles never took the least notice of our uproars. An imperturbable and speechless man, he sat at supper, with Streaker present in a swoon and the odd girl Marble, only putting another potato in his cheek, or profiting by the general misery to help himself to beefsteak pie. And so, continued my sister, I exempt Bottles, considering, John, that the house is too large, and perhaps too lonely, to be kept well in hand by Bottles. You and me, I propose that we cast about among our friends for a select number of the most reliable and willing, form a society here for 3 months, wait upon ourselves, live cheerfully and socially, and see what happens. I was so charmed with my sister that I embraced her on the spot and entered into her plan with great ardor. We were in November's 3rd week, but took our measures so vigorously, and were so well seconded by the friends we confided in, that there was still a week of the month unexpired when our party all came down together merrily, and mustered in the haunted house. I'll mention here 2 small changes I made while my sister and I were alone. It occurring to me that Turk howled partly because he wanted out, I stationed him in his kennel outside, but unchained. I warned the village that any man crossing his path must not expect to leave without a rip in his throat. I then casually asked Icky if he were a judge of a gun. On his saying, "Yes, sir, I knows a good gun when I sees her," I begged the favor of his looking at mine. "She's a true one, sir," said Icky, after inspecting a double-barreled rifle I'd bought in New York. "No mistake about her, sir." "Icky," I said, "don't mention it, but I have seen something in this house." "No, sir," he whispered, greedily opening his eyes. "Hooded lady, sir." "Don't be frightened," said I. "It was a figure rather like you." "Lord, sir, Icky," I said, shaking his hand warmly, affectionately even, if there's truth in these ghost stories. "The greatest service I can do you is fire at that figure. And I promise you, by heaven and earth, I will, if I see it again." He thanked me and left with some precipitation, declining a drink. I'd imparted my secret because I hadn't forgotten his throwing his cap at the bell, and because I'd noticed something like a fur cap near the bell one night when it rang, and because we were at our ghost list whenever he came up to comfort the servants. Let me do Icky no injustice. He was afraid of the house and believed it haunted, and yet would play false on the haunting side, given the opportunity. The odd girl's case was similar. She went about terrified, yet lied monstrously, inventing alarms and sounds. I had my eye on both of them. It isn't necessary for me to account for this preposterous state of mind. I'll just remark that it's familiar to every intelligent man with medical, legal, or other watchful experience. It's as common a state of mind as any with which observers are acquainted, and it's one of the first elements, above all others, rationally to be suspected in, looked for, and separated from any question of this kind. To return to our party, we first drew lots for bedrooms. That done, and every bedroom and the whole house minutely examined, we allotted household duties as if on a gypsy, yachting, or hunting party, or were shipwrecked. I then recounted the rumors concerning the hooded lady, the owl and Master B, with other flimsier ones from our occupation, relative to a ridiculous old female ghost carrying the ghost of a round table and an impalpable jackass nobody could catch. I believe our people below communicated some of these ideas to each other in some diseased way, without conveying them in words. We then gravely called one another to witness that we were not there to deceive or be deceived, which we considered pretty much the same thing, and that, with a serious sense of responsibility, we would be true to one another and follow out the truth. The understanding was that anyone hearing unusual noises and wishing to trace them should knock at my door. Lastly, that on 12th night, the last night of Holy Christmas, our experiences since our coming together would be brought to light for all, and that we would hold our peace until then, unless remarkably provoked to break silence. We were, in number and character, as follows. First, to get my sister and myself out of the way, there were we two. In drawing lots, my sister drew her own room, and I drew Master B's. Next, our first cousin, John Herschel, so called after the great astronomer, than whom I suppose a better man at a telescope does not breathe. With him was his wife, a charming creature he'd married the previous spring. I thought it imprudent, under the circumstances, to bring her, as there's no knowing what even a false alarm may do. But I suppose he knew his business best. I must say, had she been my wife, I never could have left her bright face behind. They drew the clock room. Alfred Starling, an uncommonly agreeable fellow of 28, for whom I have the greatest liking, was in the double room mine, usually, so designated from having a dressing room within, with two cumbersome windows that no wedges kept from shaking, wind or no wind. Alfred pretends to be fast, another word for loose, as I understand the term, but is too good and sensible for that nonsense. He would have distinguished himself by now, had his father not left him a small independence of 200 a year, on the strength of which his only occupation has been to spend 6. I'm in hopes his banker may break, or that he may enter a speculation guaranteed to pay 20%, for if he could only be ruined, his fortune is made. Belinda Bates, my sister's bosom friend and a most intellectual, amiable, delightful girl, got the picture room. She has a fine genius for poetry, combined with business earnestness, and goes in, to use Alfred's expression, for women's mission, rights, wrongs, and everything that is woman's with a capital W, or is not and ought to be, or is and ought not to be. Most praiseworthy, my dear, and heaven prosper you, I whispered, on the first night of taking leave of her at her door. But don't overdo it. And in respect of the great necessity for more employments being within woman's reach than our civilization has assigned to her, don't fly at the unfortunate men, even those in your way, as if they were your sex's natural oppressors. For, trust me, Belinda, they sometimes spend their wages among wives, daughters, sisters, mothers, aunts, and grandmothers. The play is not all Wolf and Red Riding Hood, but has other parts. However, I digress. Belinda, as mentioned, occupied the picture room. We had but 3 other chambers: the corner room, the cupboard room, and the garden room. My old friend Jack Governor slung his hammock, as he called it, in the corner room. I've always regarded Jack as the finest looking sailor that ever sailed. He is grey now, but as handsome as he was a quarter-century ago. Nay, handsomer. A portly, cheery, well-built, broad-shouldered figure, with a frank smile, brilliant dark eye, and rich dark eyebrow. I remember those under darker hair, and they look the better for their silver setting. He has been wherever his Union namesake flies. I've met his old shipmates in the Mediterranean and across the Atlantic, who have beamed and brightened at his name, crying, "You know Jack Governor, then you know a prince of men, that he is, and so unmistakably a naval officer. That if you met him coming out of an Eskimo snow hut in sealskin, you'd be vaguely persuaded he was in full uniform. Jack once had that bright, clear eye of his on my sister, but married another lady and took her to South America, where she died. This was a dozen years ago, or more. He brought down to our haunted house a small cask of salt beef, for he's convinced all other salt beef is carrion, and when in London, invariably packs a piece in his portmanteau. He'd also volunteered to bring one Nat Beaver, an old comrade, captain of a merchantman. Mr. Beaver, with a thick-set wooden face and figure, and apparently as hard as a block all over, proved an intelligent man, with a world of watery experiences and great practical knowledge. At times, there was a curious nervousness about him, apparently from some old illness, but it seldom lasted. He got the cupboard room next to Mr. Undery, my friend and solicitor, who came down to go through with it, as he said, and who plays whist better than the whole law list, from the red cover at the beginning to the red cover at the end. I never was happier in my life, and I believe it was the universal feeling among us. Jack, Governor, always a man of wonderful resources, was chief cook and made some of the best dishes I ever ate, including unapproachable curries. My sister was pastry cook and confectioner. Starling and I were cook's mate, turn and turn about, and on special occasions the chief cook pressed Mr. Beaver. We had a great deal of outdoor sport, but nothing was neglected within, and there was no ill humor or misunderstanding among us. Our evenings were so delightful that we had at least one good reason for being reluctant to go to bed. We had a few night alarms in the beginning. On the first night, I was knocked up by Jack with a wonderful ship's lantern, like the gills of some deep-sea monster. He informed me he was going aloft to the main truck to have the weathercock down. It was stormy, and I remonstrated, but Jack called my attention to its making a sound like a cry of despair, and said somebody would be hailing a ghost presently if it wasn't done. So, up to the housetop, where I could hardly stand for the wind, we went, accompanied by Mr. Beaver, and there Jack, lantern and all, with Mr. Beaver after him, swarmed up to the top of a cupola, some 24 feet above the chimneys, and stood upon nothing particular, coolly knocking the weathercock off, until they both got into such good spirits with the wind and height that I thought they'd never come down. Another night, they turned out again and had a chimney cowl off. Another night, they cut a sobbing and gulping water pipe away. Another night, they found out something else. On several occasions, they both, coolly, simultaneously dropped from their bedroom windows, hand over hand by their counterpanes, to overhaul something mysterious in the garden. The engagement among us was faithfully kept. Nobody revealed anything. All we knew was, if anyone's room were haunted, no one looked the worse for it. Chapter 1, Part 2. The Ghost in Master B's Room. When I settled into the triangular garret, my thoughts drifted to its previous occupant. The enigmatic Master B speculations about him were numerous and unsettling. Was his Christian name Benjamin Bissackstyle, due to a leap year birth, Bartholomew, or perhaps Bill? Did the initial B pertain to his surname, a Baxter, Black, Brown, Barker, Budgeons, Baker, or Bird? Was he a foundling, simply christened B? Or a lion-hearted lad, B for Britain or Bull? Could he be related to a lady who graced my own childhood, of the brilliant Mother Bunch's lineage? These fruitless musings plagued me. I also pondered the mysterious letter B in relation to the deceased's appearance. Did he favor blue attire? Was he a bookish boy, skilled at bowling or boxing? Perhaps, in his youth, he'd enjoyed bathing machines at Bognor, Bangor, Bournemouth, Brighton, or Broadstairs. I became haunted by the letter B curiously. I never dreamt of Master B, yet upon waking, my thoughts would latch onto him, striving to attach his initial to something fitting. For 6 nights, this continued in Master B's room, until things took a strange turn. One early morning, as I shaved, I saw not my own reflection, I am 50, but that of a boy, seemingly Master B himself. Startled, I looked around, then back at the mirror, where the boyish features remained. Confused, I paced, then returned to the glass, determined to finish shaving. Opening my eyes, I saw a young man of 24 or 5 staring back. This new ghostly visage terrified me. Closing my eyes, I tried to compose myself, but upon reopening them, I saw my deceased father, and even my grandfather, whom I'd never met. Though shaken, I kept this secret. That night, agitated, I anticipated another spectral encounter. And indeed, at 2 o'clock, I found myself sharing my bed with Master B's skeleton. We both sprang up, and a plaintive voice asked, "Where am I? What has become of me?" There stood Master B's ghost, dressed in outdated pepper and salt cloth, adorned with shiny buttons. He wore a frill, and his inky right hand rested on his stomach. His complexion and air of nausea suggested a boy who'd overindulged in medicine. "Where am I?" the little spectre repeated. Why was I born in the calomel days? Why was I given so much calomel? I honestly confessed I couldn't say. He inquired about his sister, wife, and schoolmate. I urged him to take heart, especially regarding the school friend, assuring him such boys rarely turned out well in the long run. I recounted how I'd encountered my own former schoolmates later in life, and they had been utterly disappointing. I dismissed the schoolmate as a myth, a delusion. I told him how I'd last seen him at a dinner party, hiding behind a wall of white cravats, holding forth with inconclusive opinions and an air of titanic boredom. He'd even invited himself to breakfast, a social offense of epic proportions. I'd let him in, hoping for a glimpse of the Doylance's boy, only to find him a tiresome wanderer, obsessed with the currency and proposing that the Bank of England issued trillions of 10 expending notes. The ghost listened intently. "Barber," it exclaimed when I finished. "I am not of that profession," I corrected. Condemned, the ghost lamented to shave a changing clientele. "A young man, thyself, thy father, thy grandfather, and to lie with a skeleton nightly, rising with it each morn." I shuddered. "Barber," it pursued, "follow me." I felt compelled and followed, transported from Master B's room. Most are familiar with the arduous night journeys forced upon confessing witches, who, aided by leading questions and the ever-present threat of torture, undoubtedly spoke the truth. I swear that during my time in Master B's room, the ghost led me on expeditions as long and wild as any witches. I met no goat-horned, tailed figure, holding dull receptions. Instead, I encountered more meaningful things. I followed the ghost on a broomstick, then a rocking horse I could smell the paint. Later, our transport was a hackney coach, with its distinctive aroma of stable, mangy dog and ancient bellows. I pursued the phantom on a headless donkey, or one whose head was always investigating its stomach, on ponies prone to kicking, on fairground roundabouts and swings. I even rode in a first cab, another bygone institution where the fare often shared the driver's bed. I'll spare you the full, Sinbad-like details of my travels, focusing on one experience. I was marvelously transformed. I was myself, yet not. I felt something constant within me, yet I wasn't the I who'd gone to bed. I had a smooth face, short legs, and confided an astonishing proposition to a similar creature. Building a seraglio, he readily agreed. We had no sense of respectability. It was the custom of the East, the way of Harun al-Rashid. Let us have a seraglio. The creature agreed. Our seraglio was formed from Miss Griffin's establishment. 8 ladies and 2 gentlemen. Miss Buell, aged 8 or 9, held social sway. I proposed she be the favorite. After a charmingly diffident struggle, she expressed interest, but inquired about Miss Pipson. Miss Buell, bound to Pipson in a pact of friendship, halves and no secrets till death. Questioned how to accommodate her, declaring Pipson not one of the common. Pipson, with her curly hair and blue eyes, fit my ideal of feminine beauty. I promptly replied that I regarded Miss Pipson as a fair Miss Buell then asked how to acquire her. I proposed she be inveigled by a merchant, veiled, and purchased as a slave. The other creature, destined for Grand Vizier, resisted until his hair was pulled. Won't I be jealous? Miss Buell asked shyly. Zobeide, no, I reassured. You'll always be the favorite sultana, the first place in my heart and on my throne. She consented and relayed the idea to her companions. We recruited Tabby, the house servant, whose figure resembled one of the beds, and whose face was perpetually smudged with black lead. I slipped Miss Buell a note after supper, arguing that the black lead was providential, marking Tabby as Mesro, chief of the harem's black eunuchs. The seraglio's formation wasn't without challenges. The other creature, thwarted in his ambition for the throne, developed conscientious scruples, refusing to prostrate himself before the Caliph, speaking of him disrespectfully as a mere chap, and generally behaving coarsely. However, the united seraglio's indignation quelled this rebelliousness, and I basked in the smiles of 8 of the fairest daughters of men. These smiles were covert, only bestowed when Miss Griffin looked away. There was a rumor she saw everything with a round ornament on her shawl. After dinner, we convened for an hour, entertaining the serene Harun, resting from state affairs, which were mostly arithmetical. The commander of the faithful struggled with sums. Mesraoua always attended, though Miss Griffin would ring for him with great vehemence. His performance, however, fell short of his historic reputation. He'd bring a broom into the divan. Even when Harun wore the red robe of anger, Miss Pipson's pilfering, though manageable, was never satisfactorily addressed. He'd burst into grinning exclamations of "Look at the pretties," which was neither Eastern nor respectful. When told to say Bismillah, he'd yell Hallelujah. He was too jovial, his mouth too wide, his approbation excessive. Once, upon acquiring the fair Circassian for a bargain 500,000 purses of gold, he embraced slave, favorite, and caliph altogether. God bless Mesraoua, and may his bosom have been softened by many sons and daughters since. Miss Griffin, a model of propriety, remained blissfully unaware that she paraded at the head of polygamy and Mohammedanism down Hampstead Road. Our secrets thrived on the mysterious joy of watching Miss Griffin's obliviousness and the grim satisfaction of our knowledge exceeding hers. Though she knew anything learned by rote, it was almost betrayed one Sunday. Positioned prominently in the church gallery, Miss Griffin leading, we were advertising the establishment when the description of Solomon's domestic glory was read. The moment Solomon was mentioned, conscience whispered, "Thou too, Harun." The minister, with his cast eye seemingly fixed on me, amplified conscience's voice. A crimson blush and perspiration engulfed me. The Grand Vizier went pale, and the seraglio reddened, as if Baghdad's sunset shone on them. Miss Griffin rose, surveying the children of Islam. I feared a conspiracy between church, state, and Miss Griffin, anticipating white sheets and a centennial exhibition. But Miss Griffin, with her westerly sense of rectitude, blamed apples, and we were saved. Our unity, however, was strained when Zobeide asserted a counterright for the favorite to scratch, when the commander of the faithful attempted a kiss in the palace sanctuary. The Circassian hid in a green baize book bag. Meanwhile, a young antelope of transcendent beauty from Camden Town, acquired after the holidays, held more liberal views, but wished to restrict their application to the Grand Vizier, who, having no rights, wasn't under consideration. This was resolved by appointing a very young slave as deputy. She, raised on a stool, received Haroun's kisses, intended for other sultanas, on her cheeks, and was rewarded from the lady's coffers. At the height of my bliss, I became troubled. I imagined my mother's reaction to my bringing home 8 unexpected beauties at midsummer. I considered the bed situation at home, my father's income, the baker. My despondency grew. The seraglio and malicious vizier, sensing their lord's unhappiness, amplified it with proclamations of loyalty. Their devotion plunged me into deeper wretchedness. I lay awake for hours, ruminating on my fate. I might have confessed my Solomon-like ways to Miss Griffin, begging for punishment under British law if an unexpected escape hadn't presented itself. One gloomy day, as we walked 2 by 2, the vizier instructed to note the turnpike boys leering at the harem, and have him bowstring that night. An event plunged the state into disgrace. The antelope, falsely claiming a birthday and the arrival of gifts, had secretly invited 35 princes and princesses to a ball and supper, stipulating a midnight arrival. This led to a grand full-dress company arriving at Miss Griffin's door, only to be tearfully dismissed. The antelope had barricaded herself in the attic, and Miss Griffin, increasingly distraught with each arrival, was last seen tearing her hair. The antelope, after capitulating, was confined to the linen closet with bread, water, and a vindictive lecture from Miss Griffin, using phrases like, "I believe you all knew. Every one of you is as wicked as another, and a pack of little wretches." We walked drearily, my Muslim responsibilities weighing heavily on me. A strange man approached Miss Griffin. After a brief conversation, he looked at me. Assuming him a minion of the law, I fled, aiming for Egypt via the pub on the left. The seraglio cried out. I imagined the quickest route to the pyramids. Miss Griffin screamed. The vizier chased, and the turnpike boy cut me off like a sheep. Nobody scolded me upon my capture. Miss Griffin merely remarked, with unnerving gentleness, this was very curious. She asked why I'd run. Breathless, I couldn't answer. They escorted me back to the palace, where Miss Griffin summoned Messeru, chief of the harem guards. Messeru, upon being whispered to, wept. "Bless you, my precious," he said, turning to me. "Your pause took bitter bad. Is he very ill?" I asked fearfully. "Lord, temper the wind to you, my lamb," sobbed the good Messeru, kneeling for me to rest my head. "Your pause, dead." Haroun al-Rashid took flight at those words. The seraglio vanished, never to be seen again. I was taken home to debt and death. We had a sale. My own bed, deemed insufficient by the trade, was augmented with a coal scuttle, roasting jack, and birdcage before being sold for a song. I never whispered of Haroun or my seraglio, fearing I'd be driven to drown myself in the muddy, beer-like pond. Ah me, ah me. No other ghost haunts the boy's room but that of my childhood. Innocence and airy belief. I often chase it, but never with these man's legs to reach it, never with these man's hands to touch it, nor with this man's heart to hold it pure. And so, cheerfully and thankfully, I shave a changing clientele in the glass, lying down and rising with my skeletal companion. Chapter 2. The Trial for Murder. I've noticed a common lack of courage, even among intellectuals, about sharing unusual psychological experiences. Most fear their stories won't resonate or will be met with ridicule. A traveler seeing a sea serpent would readily share the tale. But the same traveler experiencing a strange premonition, impulse, vision, dream, or other remarkable mental phenomenon hesitates. Stories 2. A man's spectral vision. A man, hesitant to disclose a peculiar experience, attributes the obscurity surrounding such matters to a general reticence in sharing subjective encounters. Unlike objective observations, we rarely discuss these internal phenomena, leading to a fragmented and imperfect understanding of such experiences. He clarifies that he intends neither to endorse nor refute any existing theories regarding spectral illusions, citing his familiarity with documented cases like the bookseller of Berlin and the astronomer royal's wife. His own experience, involving a lady within his social circle, was unrelated to any familial connection, hereditary peculiarity, or prior similar encounters. The narrative begins with a murder in England, a sensational case he'd rather forget, yet crucial to his story. He purposefully avoids revealing the criminal's identity, emphasizing that initially, no public suspicion fell on the eventual suspect. Reading the newspaper account of the murder's discovery in a bedroom, he experienced a fleeting, vivid vision of the room, noting the absence of a body. This occurred in his Piccadilly chambers, near St. James's Street, a mundane setting that made the sensation even more jarring. The experience was entirely novel, accompanied by a shiver that moved his chair, though it was on casters. Drawn to his window by the bright autumn morning, he observed two men walking below. The first frequently glanced back, while the second followed with a menacingly raised hand. Their smooth movement through the crowd, unnoticed by passers-by, struck him as odd. As they passed, they stared up at him, their faces distinct enough to recognize. The first with a lowering countenance, the second with a waxen complexion. A bachelor, employed at a branch bank, he describes his life as monotonous, feeling jaded and slightly dyspeptic. His doctor, he assures, confirmed this as his general state of health. He deliberately avoided news of the murder trial to maintain his mental equilibrium, though aware of the verdict and the suspect's committal to Newgate. He couldn't recall if he knew the trial's rescheduled date. One night, while instructing his servant, John Derrick, he saw the waxen-faced man beckoning from the dressing room door. Upon investigation, the room was empty, yet his servant, upon being touched, exclaimed that he too had seen a dead man beckoning. Convinced Derrick's impression originated from him, he gave them both brandy. He was certain he'd only seen the beckoning face once before, in Piccadilly. Later, Derrick brought a jury summons for the upcoming sessions at the Old Bailey. Derrick, assuming the summons was a mistake, initially refused it. The server remained indifferent, leaving the decision and potential consequences to him. Undecided for days, lacking any conscious pull, he ultimately viewed it as a break from routine. The November morning was foggy, the courthouse passages dimly lit by gas. He wasn't certain he'd known beforehand that the murder trial was scheduled for that day, or that his summons was for that specific court. Taking his seat amongst the jurors, he observed the fog-laden courtroom. The judges entered, the murderer was brought forth, and he recognized him as the first man from Piccadilly. Called to the jury box, he noted the prisoner's sudden agitation upon seeing him. The prisoner's desire to challenge him was evident, causing a pause. Later, He learned the prisoner's initial, unexplained plea was to challenge him, yet he ultimately didn't. To avoid dwelling on the murderer, whose long trial is tangential to his personal experience, he focuses on the ensuing 10 days and nights the jury was sequestered. Chosen foreman, he experienced an inexplicable difficulty counting his fellow jurors, consistently totaling 13. They, however, counted 12. This discrepancy, without a visible figure to account for it, foreshadowed the imminent return of the spectral presence. Housed at the London Tavern, the jury slept in a single room under the watchful eye of Mr. Harker, a respected officer. On the second night, a peculiar shiver crossed Mr. Harker as he sat on his bed, prompting him to question, "Who is this?" Following Harker's gaze, he saw the waxen-faced man again. Harker, unfazed, attributed it to the moonlight. Observing discreetly, he watched the figure pause by each juror's bedside, always on the right, before seemingly exiting through a high window. The next morning, it emerged that all but he and Mr. Harker had dreamt of the murdered man. Convinced the second man from Piccadilly was the murdered man, a startling confirmation was yet to come. On the fifth day, a miniature portrait of the victim, found where the murderer had been seen digging, was presented as evidence. As it was passed to him, the waxen-faced figure materialized, handed him the locket containing the miniature, and whispered that he was younger then, his face not yet drained of blood. The figure then moved between the jurors, ensuring the locket passed through each of their hands before returning to him. Remarkably, none of the other jurors noticed this spectral intervention. The jury's discussions intensified after the prosecution rested. Amongst them were a particularly obtuse vestryman and 2 equally dense associates, impaneled from a fever-ridden district. Near midnight, amidst their loud arguments, he again saw the murdered man beckoning. The appearances continued, confined to their sequestered room, the figure's head materializing amongst the jurors whenever they conferred, beckoning insistently when their discussions went against the accused. Notably, until the miniature's presentation, the figure hadn't appeared in court. 3 significant shifts occurred as the defense began. First, the figure now continuously appeared in court, but addressed itself to whoever was speaking. When the defense suggested suicide, the figure, its throat visibly cut, mimed the impossibility of self-infliction. When a character witness praised the prisoner's amiability, it pointed accusingly at his countenance. The third change was the most profound. While the apparition remained unseen by those it addressed, its presence evoked noticeable unease. He sensed it was bound by laws preventing full revelation, yet capable of subtly influencing their minds. The defense counsel faltered, losing his composure as the figure hovered near, pointing at its throat. The character witness hesitated, her gaze drawn to the figure's accusing finger, resting uneasily on the prisoner. On the 8th day, he saw the figure leaning over a woman in the gallery, seemingly checking for the judge's return. The woman promptly screamed and fainted. Later, as the judge began his summation, the figure appeared by his desk, peering at his notes. The judge faltered, complaining of the air, needing water to recover. Throughout the monotonous trial, the figure remained distinct, never once looking at the accused, nor at him after the miniature incident, until the trial's closing minutes. Retiring to deliberate, the vestryman and his cohorts caused repeated returns to court for clarification of the judge's notes, obstructing the process. Finally, at 12:10 a.m., they returned, the murdered man standing opposite the jury box. As he, the foreman, took his seat, the figure watched intently, then covered itself with a grey veil. As the guilty verdict was delivered, the figure vanished. The murderer asked for his final words, muttered indistinct complaints of an unfair trial due to the foreman's prejudice. His actual statement was far more chilling. He claimed to have known he was doomed when the foreman entered the jury box, alleging that he'd visited his bedside, placing a rope around his neck. Stories 3. A curious encounter. At the door of his box, with a flag in his hand, furled round its short pole, one would have thought, considering the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came. He seemed startled, as if unexpectedly roused from a deep reverie. The setting sun cast long shadows across the deep cutting, making the scene even more dramatic. But instead of looking up to where I stood on the top of the steep cutting nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. His gaze swept along the tracks, as if searching for the source of the sound, even though it was clearly above him. There was an odd hesitation in his movements, a reluctance to acknowledge my presence. There was something remarkable in his manner of doing so, though I could not have said for my life what it was, as if he was compelled to look elsewhere, avoiding my direct gaze. Perhaps it was the isolation of his post, playing tricks on his mind. But I know it was remarkable enough to attract my notice, even though his figure was foreshortened and shadowed down in the deep trench, and mine was high above him, so steeped in the glow of an angry sunset that I had shaded my eyes with my hand before I saw him at all. "Hello, below there." From looking down the line, he turned himself about again, and, raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. "Is there any path by which I can come down and speak to you?" He looked up at me without replying, his face inscrutable. I looked down at him, giving him time to respond, not wanting to appear too demanding. The silence between us was punctuated only by the distant rumble of an approaching train. Just then there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back, as though it had force to draw me down. When such vapor as rose to my height from this rapid train had passed me and was skimming away over the landscape, I looked down again and saw him refurling the flag he had shown while the train went by. I repeated my inquiry, "Is there a way down?" I called, my voice echoing in the cutting. After a pause, during which he seemed to regard me with fixed attention, he motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level, some 200 or 300 yards distant. I called down to him, "All right," and made for that point. There, by dint of looking closely about me, I found a rough, zigzag descending path notched out, which I followed. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitate. It was made through a clammy stone that became oozier and wetter as I went down. For these reasons, I found the way long enough to give me time to recall the singular air of reluctance or compulsion with which he had pointed out the path. What could account for such strange behavior? When I came down low enough upon the zigzag descent to see him again, I saw that he was standing between the rails on the way by which the train had lately passed, in an attitude as if he were waiting for me to appear. He had his left hand at his chin, and that left elbow rested on his right hand, crossed over his breast. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped a moment, wondering at it. I resumed my downward way, and stepping out upon the level of the railroad, and drawing nearer to him, saw that he was a dark, sallow man, with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as ever I saw. On either side, a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective, one way only, a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon. The shorter perspective in the other direction terminating in a gloomy red light, and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, in whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot, that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it, that it struck chill to me, as if I had left the natural world. Before he stirred, I was near enough to him to have touched him. Not even then removing his eyes from mine, he stepped back one step and lifted his hand. This was a lonesome post to occupy, I said, and it had riveted my attention when I looked down from up yonder. A visitor was a rarity, I should suppose. Not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped. In me, he merely saw a man who had been shut up within narrow limits all his life, and who, being at last set free, had a newly awakened interest in these great works. To such purpose I spoke to him, but I am far from sure of the terms I used. For, besides that, I am not happy in opening any conversation. There was something in the man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth, and looked all about it, as if something were missing from it, and then looked at me, ... That light was part of his charge, was it not? He answered in a low voice, "Don't you know, it is." The monstrous thought came into my mind, as I perused the fixed eyes and the saturnine face, that this was a spirit, not a man. I have speculated since, whether there may have been infection in his mind. In my turn, I stepped back, but in making the action, I detected in his eyes some latent fear of me. This put the monstrous thought to flight. "You look at me," I said, forcing a smile, "as if you had a dread of me." ... I was doubtful, he returned, whether I had seen you before. "Where?" He pointed to the red light he had looked at. "There," I said. Intently watchful of me, he replied, but without sound. "Yes, my good fellow, what should I do there? However, be that as it may, I never was there, you may swear." "I think I may," he rejoined. "Yes, I am sure I may." His manner cleared, like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness, and in well-chosen words. Had he much to do there? Yes, that was to say, he had enough responsibility to bear, but exactness and watchfulness were what was required of him, and of actual work, manual labor, he had next to none. To change that signal, to trim those lights, and to turn this iron handle now and then, was all he had to do under that head. Regarding those many long and lonely hours, of which I seemed to make so much, he could only say that the routine of his life had shaped itself into that form, and he had grown used to it. He had taught himself a language down here, if only to know it by sight, and to have formed his own crude ideas of its pronunciation could be called learning it. He had also worked at fractions and decimals, and tried a little algebra, but he was, and had been, as a boy, a poor hand at figures. Was it necessary for him, when on duty, always to remain in that channel of damp air, and could he never rise into the sunshine from between those high stone walls? Why, that depended upon times and circumstances. Under some conditions there would be less upon the line than under others, and the same held good as to certain hours of the day and night. In bright weather, he did choose occasions for getting a little above these lower shadows, but being at all times liable to be called by his electric bell, and at such times listening for it with redoubled anxiety, the relief was less than I would suppose. He took me into his box, where there was a fire, a desk for an official book in which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial, face, and needles, and the little bell of which he had spoken. On my trusting that he would excuse the remark that he had been well educated, and I hoped I might say without offense, perhaps educated above that station, he observed that instances of slight incongruity in such wise would rarely be found wanting among large bodies of men. that he had heard it was so in workhouses, in the police force, even in that last desperate resource, the army, and that he knew it was so, more or less, in any great railway staff. He had been, when young, if I could believe it, sitting in that hut. He scarcely could, a student of natural philosophy, and had attended lectures. But he had run wild, misused his opportunities, gone down, and never risen again. He had no complaint to offer about that. He had made his bed, and he lay upon it. It was far too late to make another. All that I have here condensed, he said in a quiet manner, with his grave, dark regards divided between me and the fire. He threw in the word, sir, from time to time, and especially when he referred to his youth, as though to request me to understand that he claimed to be nothing but what I found him. He was several times interrupted by the little bell, and had to read off messages and send replies. Once he had to stand without the door and display a flag as a train passed, and make some verbal communication to the driver. In the discharge of his duties, I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant, breaking off his discourse at a syllable, and remaining silent until what he had to do was done. In a word, I should have set this man down as one of the safest of men to be employed in that capacity, but for the circumstance that while he was speaking to me, he twice broke off with a fallen color, turned his face towards the little bell when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut, which was kept shut to exclude the unhealthy damp, and looked out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both of those occasions, he came back to the fire with the inexplicable air upon him which I had remarked, without being able to define when we were so far asunder. Said I, when I rose to leave him, "You almost make me think that I have met with a contented man." I am afraid I must acknowledge that I said it to lead him on. "I believe I used to be so," he rejoined, in the low voice in which he had first spoken. "But I am troubled, sir, I am troubled." He would have recalled the words if he could. He had said them, however, and I took them up quickly. "With what? What is your trouble?" "It is very difficult to impart, sir. It is very, very difficult to speak of. If ever you make me another visit, I will try to tell you, but I expressly intend to make you another visit. Say, when shall it be?" "I go off early in the morning, and I shall be on again at 10 tomorrow night, sir." "I will come at 11. He thanked me and went out at the door with me. "I'll show my white light, sir," he said, in his peculiar low voice, "till you have found the way up. When you have found it, don't call out. And when you are at the top, don't call out." His manner seemed to make the place strike colder to me, but I said no more than, "Very well. And when you come down tomorrow night, don't call out. Let me ask you a parting question. What made you cry, hello, below there, tonight?" "Heaven knows," said I. "I cried something to that effect." "Not to that effect, sir. Those were the very words. I know them well. Admit those were the very words. I said them, no doubt, because I saw you below, for no other reason. What other reason could I possibly have? You had no feeling that they were conveyed to you in any supernatural way, no." He wished me good night and held up his light. I walked by the side of the down line of rails, with a very disagreeable sensation of a train coming behind me, until I found the path. It was easier to mount than to descend, and I got back to my inn without any adventure. Punctual to my appointment, I placed my foot on the first notch of the zigzag next night, as the distant clocks were striking 11. He was waiting for me at the bottom, with his white light on. "I have not called out," I said, when we came close together. "May I speak now?" "By all means, sir." "Good night then, and here's my hand." "Good night, sir, and here's mine." With that, we walked side by side to his box, entered it, closed the door, and sat down by the fire. "I have made up my mind, sir," he began, bending forward as soon as we were seated, and speaking in a tone but a little above a whisper, "that you shall not have to ask me twice what troubles me. I took you for someone else yesterday evening. That troubles me. That mistake. No, that's someone else. Who is it? I don't know. Like me, I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is waved. Violently waved. This way." I followed his action with my eyes, and it was the action of an arm gesticulating, with the utmost passion and vehemence. "For God's sake, clear the way." "One moonlight night," said the man, "I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry, 'Hello, below there.' I started up, looked from that door, and saw this someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving as I just now showed you. The voice seemed hoarse with shouting, and it cried, 'Look out, look out,' and then again, 'Hello, below there, look out.' I caught up my lamp, turned it on red, and ran towards the figure, calling, 'What's wrong? What has happened?' Where? It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel. I advanced so close upon it that I wondered at its keeping the sleeve across its eyes. I ran right up at it, and had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away when it was gone. 'Into the tunnel,' said I. No, I ran on into the tunnel, 500 yards. I stopped, and held my lamp above my head, and saw the figures of the measured distance, and saw the wet stains stealing down the walls and trickling through the arch. I ran out again, faster than I had run in, for I had a mortal abhorrence of the place upon me, and I looked all round the red light with my own red light. And I went up the iron ladder to the gallery atop of it, and I came down again, and ran back here. I telegraphed both ways. An alarm has been given. Is anything wrong? The answer came back, both ways, all well. Resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing out my spine, I showed him how that this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight, and how that figures, originating in disease of the delicate nerves that minister to the functions of the eye, were known to have often troubled patients, some of whom had become conscious of the nature of their affliction, and had even proved it by experiments upon themselves. As to an imaginary cry, said I, do but listen for a moment to the wind in this unnatural valley while we speak so low, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires. That was all very well, he returned, after we had sat listening for a while. And he ought to know something of the wind and the wires, he who so often passed long winter nights there, alone and watching. But he would beg to remark that he had not finished. I asked his pardon, and he slowly added these words, touching my arm. Within 6 hours after the appearance, the memorable accident on this line happened, and within 10 hours, the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over the spot where the figure had stood. A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. It was not to be denied. I rejoined that this was a remarkable coincidence, calculated deeply to impress his mind. But it was unquestionable that remarkable coincidences did continually occur, and they must be taken into account in dealing with such a subject. Though to be sure, I must admit, I added, for I thought I saw that he was going to bring the objection to bear upon me. Men of common sense did not allow much for coincidences in making the ordinary calculations of life. He again begged to remark that he had not finished. I again begged his pardon for being betrayed into interruptions. This, he said, again laying his hand upon my arm and glancing over his shoulder with hollow eyes, was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I had recovered from the surprise and shock when one morning as the day was breaking, I, standing at the door, looked towards the red light and saw the spectre again. He stopped with a fixed look at me. Did it cry out? No, it was silent. Did it wave its arm? No. It leaned against the shaft of light with both hands before the face, like this. Once more, I followed his action with my eyes. It was an action of mourning. I have seen such an attitude in stone figures on tombs. Did you go up to it? I came in and sat down, partly to collect my thoughts, partly because it had turned me faint. When I went to the door again, daylight was above me, and the ghost was gone. But nothing followed. Nothing came of this. He touched me on the arm with his forefinger, twice or thrice, giving a ghastly nod each time. That very day, as a train came out of the tunnel, I noticed, at a carriage window on my side, what looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal the driver, stop. He shut off and put his brake on, but the train drifted past here 150 yards or more. I ran after it, and, as I went along, heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments, and was brought in here and laid down on this floor between us. Involuntarily, I pushed my chair back as I looked from the boards at which he pointed to himself. True, sir, true. Precisely as it happened, so I tell it you. I could think of nothing to say, to any purpose, and my mouth was very dry. The wind and the wires took up the story with a long, lamenting wail. He resumed. Now, sir, mark this, and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since, it has been there now and again, by fits and starts. At the light, at the danger light. What does it seem to do? He repeated, if possible with increased passion and vehemence. That former gesticulation of, for God's sake, clear the way. Then he went on, I have no peace or rest for it. It calls to me, for many minutes together, in an agonized manner, below there. Look out, it stands, waving to me. It rings my little bell. I caught it that. Did it ring your bell yesterday evening when I was here, and you went to the door, twice? Why, see, said I, how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on the bell, and my ears were open to the bell, and if I am a living man, it did not ring at those times. No, nor at any other time, except when it was rung in the natural course of physical things by the station communicating with you. He shook his head. I have never made a mistake as to that yet, sir. I have never confused the spectre's ring with the man's. The ghost's ring is a strange vibration in the bell that it derives from nothing else, and I have not asserted that the bell stirs to the eye. I don't wonder that you failed to hear it, but I heard it. And did the spectre seem to be there when you looked out? It was there, both times. He repeated firmly, both times. Will you come to the door with me and look for it now? He bit his underlip as though he was somewhat unwilling, but arose. I opened the door and stood on the step while he stood in the doorway. There was the danger light. There was the dismal mouth of the tunnel. There were the high, wet stone walls of the cutting. There were the stars above them. Do you see it? I asked him, taking particular note of his face. His eyes were prominent and strained, but not very much more so, perhaps, than my own had been when I had directed them earnestly towards the same spot. No, he answered. It is not there. Agreed, said I. We went in again, shut the door, and resumed our seats. I was thinking how best to improve this advantage, if it might be called one, when he took up the conversation in such a matter-of-course way, so assuming that there could be no serious question of fact between us. that I felt myself placed in the weakest of positions. "By this time, you will fully understand, sir," he said, "that what troubles me so dreadfully is the question, what does the spectre mean?" I was not sure. I told him that I did fully understand. "What is its warning against?" he said, ruminating, with his eyes on the fire, and only by times turning them on me. "What is the danger? Where is the danger?" "There is danger overhanging somewhere on the line. Some dreadful calamity will happen. It is not to be doubted this third time, after what has gone before. But surely this is a cruel haunting of me. What can I do?" He pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the drops from his heated forehead. "If I telegraph danger on either side of me, or on both, I can give no reason for it," he went on, wiping the palms of his hands. "I should get into trouble and do no good. They would think I was mad. This is the way it would work. Message: danger. Take care. Answer. What danger? Where? Message. Don't know, but, for God's sake, take care." They would displace me. What else could they do? His pain of mind was most pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. When it first stood under the danger light, he went on, putting his dark hair back from his head, and drawing his hands outward across and across his temples in an extremity of feverish distress. "Why not tell me where that accident was to happen, if it must happen? Why not tell me how it could be averted, if it could have been averted? When on its second coming it hid its face, why not tell me, instead, she is going to die? Let them keep her at home." If it came, on those two occasions, only to show me that its warnings were true, and so to prepare me for the third, why not warn me plainly now, and I, Lord help me, a mere poor signalman on this solitary station? Why not go to somebody with credit to be believed, and power to act? When I saw him in this state, I saw that for the poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, what I had to do for the time was to compose his mind. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality between us, I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duty must do well, and that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. In this effort I succeeded far better than in the attempt to reason him out of his conviction. He became calm. The occupations incidental to his post as the night advance began to make larger demands on his attention, and I left him at 2 in the morning. I had offered to stay through the night, but he would not hear of it. That I, more than once, looked back at the red light as I ascended the pathway, that I did not like the red light, and that I should have slept but poorly if my bed had been under it, I see no reason to conceal. Nor did I like the 2 sequences of the accident and the dead girl. I see no reason to conceal that either. But what ran most in my thoughts was the consideration, how ought I to act, having become the recipient of this disclosure? I had proved the man to be intelligent, vigilant, painstaking, and exact. But how long might he remain so in his state of mind? Though in a subordinate position, still he held a most important trust. And would I, for instance, like to stake my own life on the chances of his continuing to execute it with precision, unable to overcome a feeling that there would be something treacherous in my communicating what he had told me to his superiors in the company, without first being plain with himself and proposing a middle course to him? I ultimately resolved to offer to accompany him, otherwise keeping his secret for the present, to the wisest medical practitioner we could hear of in those parts, and to take his opinion. A change in his time of duty would come round next night. He had apprised me, and he would be off an hour or 2 after sunrise, and on again soon after sunset. I had appointed to return accordingly. Next evening was a lovely evening. and I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not yet quite down when I traversed the field path near the top of the deep cutting. I would extend my walk for an hour, I said to myself, half an hour on and half an hour back. And it would then be time to go to my signalman's box. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink and mechanically looked down from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when, close at the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man, with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment, for in a moment I saw that this appearance of a man was a man indeed, and that there was a little group of other men standing at a short distance to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. The danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft, a little low hut, entirely new to me, had been made of some wooden supports and tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed, with an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with a flashing, self-reproachful fear that fatal mischief had come of my leaving the man there, and causing no one to be sent to overlook or correct what he did. I descended the notched path with all the speed I could make. "What is the matter?" I asked the men. "Signalman killed this morning, sir. Not the man belonging to that box." "Yes, sir. Not the man I know." "You will recognize him, sir, if you knew him," said the man who spoke for the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising an end of the tarpaulin, for his face is quite composed. "Oh, how did this happen? How did this happen?" I asked, turning from one to another as the hut closed in again. "He was cut down by an engine, sir. No man in England knew his work better, but somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just at broad day. He had struck the light and had the lamp in his hand. As the engine came out of the tunnel, his back was towards her, and she cut him down. That man drove her and was showing how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom." The man, who wore a rough dark dress, stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. "Coming round the curve in the tunnel, sir," he said. "I saw him at the end, like as if I saw him down a perspective glass. There was no time to check speed, and I knew him to be very careful. As he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle, I shut it off when we were running down upon him, and called to him as loud as I could call. 'What did you say?' I said. 'Below there, look out, look out. For God's sake, clear the way,' I started. Ah, it was a dreadful time, sir. I never left off calling to him. I put this arm before my eyes, not to see, and I waved this arm to the last. But it was no use. Without prolonging the narrative to dwell on any one of its curious circumstances more than on any other, I may, in closing it, point out the coincidence that the warning of the engine driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached, and that only in my own mind, to the gesticulation he had imitated. Thank you for joining us on this haunting adventure through Charles Dickens' 3 ghost stories. We hope you enjoyed the chilling tales and the eerie atmosphere crafted by Dickens. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Storytime Haven for more captivating stories and literary classics. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with wonder and intrigue.